Two presidential commissions in Tanzania have recommended the continuation of mass evictions of Maasai communities from key conservation areas, including the Ngorongoro Conservation Area. The move comes despite global criticism and ongoing resistance from the Maasai, who have long lived on and relied on these ancestral lands. Human rights groups, including Survival International, have strongly condemned the recommendations, warning that they threaten both the rights and livelihoods of Indigenous communities. And for more on this, we're joined by Linda Poppe from Survival International. What brought about even, looking at such a recommendation? I know it has been a rather controversial issue for quite a while, not only in Tanzania, we've seen it in Uganda and Kenya as well. But let's look at Tanzania's own background.
Indeed. It's quite a terrible situation, which has been going on for quite a while. It's good to be here. Thank you for having me. Survival has worked with the Maasai for a long time, and in recent years, the situation has really escalated. There were massive protests of Maasai in 2024 against evictions from, you already mentioned Ngorongoro, for example, or the evictions in Loliondo also made world headlines. And following these protests and international and national criticism, the president has established these two presidential commissions, which have been, so to say, investigating the situation. And they now presented their findings, which are terrible, to be honest. They negate all the problems with the evictions. They advocate for more evictions. So they're actually, opening the path for mass evictions of Maasai from their ancestral lands in some of the most famous conservation areas the world knows, and all of this is Maasai land.
And this is what I'm wondering, because the globe over, there has been a drive to conserve these lands and the peoples of it, and including legislation that has been enacted that nothing must be done to endanger it and its populace. So what is the rationale behind what Tanzania is doing? What are they saying? Because I know that they've also been accusing NGOs of spreading misinformation.
Well, they claim they do this for conservation, but there's no way that this can be done for conservation. Everything we know about conservation and indigenous peoples, including the Maasai and their cattle herding, says that indigenous ownership of lands is the best way to conserve lands. And the Maasai are saying that themselves. They've provided lots of proof. They have developed their own conservation vision. All of this is entirely ignored by the government and the president. And they're claiming that this is necessary, which is just not true. There are other interests behind this. For example, tourism, which is a big thing in these areas that we're now talking about, in Ngorongoro, for example. And a lot of tourists apparently don't want to see cattle and Maasai. And the government also wants to cash in on more exclusive tourist reserves on Maasai land. So I think that is a big thing, even though they do claim this is for conservation. And we know that a lot of conservationists do say that people and nature can't go together, but this is really their colonial ideas of conservation and the separation of humans and nature, and has nothing to do with indigenous land management as the Maasai are doing this, and has nothing to do with everything that science now also tells us about indigenous guardianship.
And which is very strange, because the very history and heritage of African people is that of an ecosystem that has evolved and blended well over years, even with population growth between, man, animals, and fauna. So, are they using any scientific studies to, bolster their arguments, or is it just a PR exercise? Because we know that the Maasai have coexisted with wildlife and fauna for centuries.
Exactly, that's what they've done. The government is really using a very old racist and colonial narrative about population growth. They're saying there's just too many Maasai and too many cattle, which really isn't the issue for conservation and climate. We know that it's not necessarily the Maasai that have, for example, the biggest carbon footprint or the biggest impact on the environment. But for example, in the Ngorongoro Conservation Area, tourism is a major factor, which is, bad for the availability of water. There are roads, there are, tourist cars going into these areas all the time. It's a massive industry, which apparently the government doesn't see as a problem, whereas the Maasai who are living off this land, the land is key to their survival and key to their identity. They're being blamed for natural destruction, for destruction of these areas, which is absolutely, it's just fabricated. And these commissions are also fabricating reasons now for evicting Maasai.
And, as you're talking, and I'm thinking of if one needs a practical example of how that tourism drive has actually completely decimated what used to be natural land, one needs only look at Zanzibar, particularly Stone Town, how that spread incrementally even onto the beaches so that there could be these tourist exercises, and the Maasai were forced to, they were caricatured really, they just to earn money. So has the government thought of thinking outside of the box, of seeing how, if there is to be relocation, how they can do it in such a way that they still maintain the indigenous knowledge systems and, apply them to other parts of the country?
Well, we have to be very clear that the Maasai, they have land rights and they need a livelihood, and this is their land. So there's really not much that the government can do other than respecting the lands if it wants to comply to human rights law and international standards. And that's what it should be doing. And I think if you do that, you can also have conservation. It's everything. We see that in all the places. I mean, Ngorongoro isn't beautiful despite the Maasai. It is beautiful because of the Maasai, because they have catered for this environment. That's why it's really clear that the government is either not understanding conservation or is just fabricating these reasons in order to boost tourism and evict the Maasai from their land. So there's really, in terms of conservation, you can't really explain why this is happening other than really these stereotypes about Maasai and their land, which have been around since colonial times. I'm German. I know the German colonial stereotypes that came up about the Maasai and the protection of Ngorongoro, for example. So it's really these old stories that they're now using to evict and to threaten the livelihood of the Maasai. And it's really a terrible situation. We have seen violent evictions in 2022 in Loliondo, which were really terrible. We've really seen attempts to push out the Maasai from Ngorongoro by cutting social services and healthcare. People are not being treated. For example, pregnant women can't, go to the hospital because there's no infrastructure provided. All the infrastructure that was there is being demolished. So the government is really trying everything it can to push the Maasai out of their land.
And one is not saying one ought to ignore the land rights and heritage of the Maasai, but government in 2022 launched the so-called voluntary relocation, and I remember that very well, that there were protests that became violent only because the Maasai were accused of agitating, and I know some of them lost their lives as a result of that. But what I'm asking is there a constructive way of doing that, of making sure that the Maasai who do possibly want to move get their fair share of proceeds from those land rights, etc.?
Well, I guess the government has already tried to get some people to move, and the ones that agree, they have moved, but the other ones haven't. And they're quite strong in their position to, this being voluntary relocations. There was also a statement, I think just today or yesterday, from a Maasai Alliance who have said that they're not ready to move. They object the idea of this being voluntary relocations, and they want their land rights to be recognized. I think the process, the way it's going now, it has nothing to do with voluntary. As I said, for example, the social services in Ngorongoro have been cut, and this is not a situation where the Maasai can have a discussion with the government about what is happening in the Ngorongoro Conservation Area or on their lands, because they're really being mistreated in many different ways, and lies are being told about them in public by high government officials. It's really a very difficult situation. And at the moment, it's really hard to see how this can change. The government needs to stop its attempts to blame the Maasai for environmental destruction. It needs to stop its attempts to evict Maasai, and it also needs to return areas such as Loliondo, where the Maasai were evicted, and just 3 years ago. It's really not that long ago.
All right, Linda, thank you so much for speaking to us. And of course, we will make sure that we invite them aside to speak to us to also understand what has been happening with this process. Linda Poppe is from Survival International. And of course, land is a huge issue on the African continent. Land grabs and reparations when it comes to those that people are still, I mean, even in South Africa, people are still looking to own the deeds to land that they've lived on for centuries. So we'll certainly look at that. That's Survival International, Linda Poppe.